Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our attendees. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. The topic for today's discussion is how Bank of New York Mellon is building a value-driven procurement organization. My name is Ajay Agrawal, founder and chairman at SirionLabs, the SaaS leader in enterprise contract management, and I will be your host for today. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. Webinar slides and recording will be emailed to attendees, and we request you to enter your questions in the chat panel on the webinar panel on your right. Here's a quick overview of the organizations featuring in today's webinar. The Bank of New York Mellon is a global investments company dedicated to helping its clients manage and service their financial assets throughout the investment life cycle. Whether providing financial services for institutions, corporations, or individual investors, Bank of New York Mellon delivers informed investment management and investment services in over 35 countries. The IACCM needs very little introduction. It is the leading organization in the world, enabling organizations and professionals to achieve world-class standards in contracting and relationship management process and skills. And I suspect a lot of you are attending this seminar primarily because of the reputation of IACCM. SirionLabs, probably the smallest of these three, is the emerging leader in enterprise contract management, and our mission is to transform the way the contracting engagement between enterprises works by bringing the parties closer to each other and by bringing the promises inside contracts to life. Here's what we'll be covering over the next 60 minutes or so. We will talk a little about why value orientation in procurement function is very important. And value meaning a much broader notion of value than merely negotiating the price in the beginning. Joseph will double click on this and take us down into Bank of New York Mellon's journey to build a value-driven procurement organization and amplify on this notion of value. And we will also talk a little about the role of technology in realizing the full value in supplier relationships. And now let me introduce you to my co-speakers for today. We will start out with Joseph Martinez, the Chief Procurement Officer of Bank of New York Mellon, who is one of the most experienced and recognizable procurement leaders in the financial sector, and particularly in banking. Tim Cummins needs very little introduction as the founder and the president of IACCM. We are very honored and pleased to have him join the webinar today from England. And I will round it off with some concluding remarks. With that, I'm going to now turn it over to Tim to set the stage and kickstart the proceedings for today. Over to you, Tim.
Ajay, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here with two undoubted leaders in this space. Joseph, who has had a series of incredible successes at operationalization of improved process and practice. Ajay, who has been devoted for many years now to providing underpinning technologies that actually enable many of these improvements. And well, I guess where I fit into all of that is that I just think. But certainly we've made, I think, all of us, a number of critical and in some cases worrying discoveries as a result of COVID-19. And of course, one can scarcely ignore the influence that that has had. What it has exposed is that contracting processes, whether being operated in support of procurement or in support of sales, have not fared particularly well. And to be fair to the people who manage and oversee that process, in most cases, that is quite definitely because of the failure of organizations to really think through contracting as a life cycle process, and secondly, the failure to make appropriate technology investments to really streamline and maintain the currency and capability of contracts and contracting for the modern organization. Three quick examples of that. Corporate Council, just a couple of weeks ago, leading article talking about the fact that contract systems are an unmitigated disaster about to get worse. And this was all about the point that the systems had really demonstrated their inability to cope with the challenge of the COVID-19 environment. People couldn't find their contracts. If they could find them, they couldn't quickly search within them. So the organizations were really fragmented in terms of their data flows and their decision-making capability. They were not able to really tackle the risks that COVID-19 created, nor to take any advantage of the opportunities it potentially created. A consequence of that, of course, is that the people on the ground who were dealing with those contracts were completely overwhelmed. And our second quote from what is actually one of the world's biggest contract management organizations, we've never been so busy. And what did that lead to? Well, I think the good news is that it led to a massive awakening of this need to make effective investment in proper technology to actually automate, to digitize the contract management process. But again, not with this focus on perhaps front-end enabling, but much more of a life cycle realization that we have to both develop, implement, and then manage our contracts effectively. So what are some key points here? Fundamentally, it's the fact that what we're talking about, and what I think we'll be talking about a lot today, is the importance of process and business information. This isn't about business function. And contract management in that context must operate as an effective gearbox for the business. It has to not only operate with its sort of, if you like, administrative responsibilities, but the critical issue is contracts and the contracts we select must align with and enable the goals and the strategies of the business, and increasingly they must be adaptive to change. We are, for example, about to launch our 2020 study of the most negotiated terms. And we already know from the research we're doing that we're going to see a fundamental shift in the terms and conditions that organizations recognize to be of critical importance in enabling more adaptive business relationships. So moving on from this particular slide, let's pick up a little bit on one of the critical points in all of this, which is contract economics. For far too long, contracts have been considered as legal instruments, not as economic assets. And they drive a process which is absolutely fundamental to the health and welfare of a business. We need to be thoughtful about value delivery in four very distinct areas. And far too often today, organizations are much too narrow in their thinking about where value comes from. Yes, the cost of upfront contracting and the cycle times must be reduced. Equally, though, we need to think about whether or not our contracts have been designed and our terms are appropriate and our resources are capable of ensuring greater value retention and greater value growth and realization post-award. And finally, are they actually reducing the cost of commercial operations, or are they in fact increasing it? You know, contract management is an absolutely critical area of the business, which employs not just hundreds of thousands of contract managers around the world, but a multitude of business operations, project management, and other functional areas that actually are predominantly contract management teams. So in conclusion, what did we discover about the critical areas of simplification? And Joseph, I suspect you may have some thoughts and comments on these, because what we discovered is that far too often organizations have, those even that have implemented any sort of contract management software, have not really given adequate thought and planning to how to make that effective. They have just tried to put technology on top of poorly defined processes, poorly structured forms of agreement. So here's a little laundry list of 5 items that I'm going to leave you with, because far too few organizations have really looked at this issue of contracting as a fundamental business asset. And with that, Joseph, let me pass through to you.
Thank you, Tim. Appreciate IACCM hosting this today and my opportunity to have a conversation with those of you on the call. So with that, we're going through a transformation here at the Bank of New York Mellon, and I think that it's really important for us to really think through, what it is that we're doing. So just a quick background and an overview on Bank of New York Mellon. Believe it or not, we were actually founded in September 235 years ago by Alexander Hamilton. So we are one of the oldest financial institutions in the country. And as you can see from the slide, we have essentially a investment management, investment services, and a global reach. So we are an organization that is very focused on working with our customers and ensuring that we put in place the right infrastructure so that our workforce across the 35 countries that we're in has the capability of supporting our goal of making sure that we are a leading financial institution that is trusted and that has the ability to provide a full range of financial operations, cash management, and global payment services with the appropriate underlying technology. If I could ask you to go to the next slide. So basically, my organization is the Global Supply Chain Management team, and we're really responsible for looking across the bank's supply chain, whether that's strategic sourcing, the category management, all the traditional components that one would take a look at. And what we decided to do when I got here about a year and 3 months ago or so was to really start to take a look at how do we actually transform, and how does that transformation across the key spend categories enable us to be much more effective. And it reminded me of a quote that I really liked from George Lechtenberg, who said, "I cannot say whether things will get better if we change. What I can say is they must change if they are to get better." And, it's an interesting play on words, but really it started to help us to think about what are the underlying pillars that we needed to think about as we started to approach our transformation. So it's not just about transforming our relationship methods or transforming the work in our team or transforming our opportunity. It's really to think about what are the underlying infrastructure pillars that we have to do. What are the positions of influence? What is that external environment of technology that we need to take a place at? How do we actually think about our process? Whether that's spend management, whether that's contracting, whether that's sourcing, whether that's partnering around looking at the risk, that process is really, really important to us. And all of that's going to lead to us really thinking about how are we going to deliver the outcomes with the metrics that matter. So, Edward Deming said that which is valued is measured, that which is measured gets done. And I firmly believe that. But you can't do that without actually having the right people, without having and developing your individuals and your teams, developing their sense of skills, and having a strong ethical undertone and underlying for that organization. And so that's essentially the high level view as we started to think about what is it that we wanted to do from an approach perspective. If I could ask you to go to the next slide, please. And so with that, what we were starting to do is when I got in, I took a look across the organization, and my early hypothesis was centered around 4 systemic weaknesses that I found. I found that we were bringing arbitrage when you take a look at the various relationships that we have with third parties and the various countries that we were operating and the multiple businesses that we had, we were finding that the vendors were actually coming and working at the sub-entity level rather than allowing us to take a look at this holistically, which I think is very important, which leads to value leakage, right? So we had suboptimal commercial outcomes based on the fact that we were really not looking at this thing holistically. We have a myriad of regulatory matters that we have to work with from a regulatory perspective because of where we're at, and we had very nascent contract management. You know, our systems were outdated and antiquated. That said, we still had the controls in place, but they were not as efficient and effective as we would like them to be. And so that led us into a whole work stream around technology optimization, which I'll get into in a bit. When we started to think about governance and control, that was really something that we needed to think about because there was really a bank-wide view of the vendors needed to be thought through, and our inability to effectively manage our commercial outcomes for the contracts that were in flight was really important. So we had arbitrage, value leakage, governance control, and inefficiencies. But in order to be able to go through that, we needed to start thinking about what were the building blocks that we needed to put in place. Okay, and those building blocks were really making sure that we had executive sponsorship and support for our business unit strategies for how we're actually going to drive the cost transformation, and understanding that business strategy was paramount because we had to align and ensure that what we were doing was aligned to the strategies of the business. That's really for most of us on this call, understanding the nuts and bolts of the business strategy that procurement is a part of. At another level, we had to have adequate knowledge of the business in order to be able to explain and understand what the concepts were that they were trying to drive and to be able to articulate the strategic value that we were going to be bringing as we partnered with them. We needed to start thinking about how do we create a cost culture and an environment to drive the change and the information that we needed across that base. And that's a pretty important differentiator for us because we need to get folks to understand that the non-comp costs really impact our cost to income ratio. And those are a direct impact on our earnings per share. So as we improve that cost culture and drive that through the expense base, ultimately that will have an impact on our earnings per share. And so in order to be able to do that, you need to make sure that you're putting the right spend management in place, the right contracting, and the right sourcing as part of that underpinning that we talked about. But you've got to make sure that you're positioning and you're creating the influence capability, whether that's at the executive sponsorship that I talked about, whether that's the cost culture and environment that drives the change, which then leads into the policies and the use of the various tools that we needed in order to be more effective around what we were doing. So industrializing cost reduction objectives is really kind of setting up buying channel compliance. And that's really, buying through from the right third party, the right process at the right price at the right amount. So what we did was we said, how do we actually stand up 6 different buying channels? And those buying channels in turn were going to allow us to have that efficiency, that risk mitigation, and that cost optimization. And so whether that was a purchase order, whether that was a T&E card, whether that was a P card, whether that was an authorized third-party system. In our case, we use a tool as an example called Beeline for bringing in our contingent labor, or even when was it appropriate to use a direct invoice. So by standing up the 6 buying channels, that allowed us to really laser focus in as to how those relationships needed to be managed more effectively. And so all of those are strategic underpinnings for what it is that we're trying to do. If I could ask you to go to the next slide. So when you think about the transformation framework that we're starting to think about, it was obviously the traditional people, process, and technology, but you start to think about it in terms of how do we double click and think about, what are the vision and the goals that we're driving? And if we're really trying to drive an integrated global platform, how do we take that platform and apply the right policies? How do we make sure that we have the right alignment from the organizational structure to make sure that we have a seat at the table. What are the types of governance programs that we put in place? As an example, we've put in category councils. We've stood up what's called an enterprise sourcing advisory council. All of this are governance forums and frameworks that enable us to be much more effective in collaborating with our businesses. And, how do we actually business partner more effectively? Because if you don't actually understand what the strategies are of your stakeholders, it's going to be very difficult for you to align what you're trying to do with them. So I started to look at the organization and say, what is the appropriate operating model that we have on a global basis? And how do we actually work with the various entities across the globe in the 35 countries that we're doing business with so that they would understand that a center-led organization makes sense with the appropriate framework in place to ensure that we have the agility and the mobility to be able to impact more effectively? How do we look at the size of the teams? How do we resource effectively so that we're putting the right skill sets against the right opportunities that we have in order for us to be effective? And how do we then upskill the organization and create a baseline? One of the things that we did, just as an example, is we've offered an industry certification to everybody across our organization within my GSCM group. And we've been going through iterative waves of certifications for industry recognized certifications that result in a common language, a common understanding, and a common framework that ultimately is going to give us the outcome that we're looking for. We just had a class that graduated, and we had the graduation ceremony about a week ago. And I think it's really great because what we're doing is we're investing in the individual for something they can take for themselves, but it's raising the level of capability across our organization. And when you think about the traditional source to contract, source to pay, and procure to pay, and the sub-elements in there, a lot of that, we've stood up a formal category strategy team. We've stood up a formal strategic sourcing organization, contracts management. And then we have that middle office that's helping us to actually drive the outcomes that we're looking, culminating in our payment process. Now, we partner with our third-party risk management group around a lot of the supplier management. But the underpinnings from a technology enablement perspective is we're actually implementing a new ERP system. It's public information where we've gone with Oracle for our ERP. We're in the middle of doing a selection for our source to pay technology, and we have actually our contract lifecycle management tool we've standardized on the SirionLabs solution in order to be able to make sure that we're tying all of those together so that I can get that front-to-back transparency, efficiency, and effectiveness. Underpinning all of that is really a lot of the process capability. We've used Six Sigma methodology. We've now taken our processes across the supply chain and that whole ecosystem down to a level 4 so that we're able to really take a look at that. We republished our policies at a global level, our procedures. We're publishing new works associated with our supplier governance handbook. We're making sure that there's a complete reboot of the work that we're doing. And that's really so that we can realign the supply chain to most effectively help the organization drive basically to the outcomes that we're doing. And so when you think about what it is that we're doing here, we're thinking about it in terms of a number of different opportunities. We think about it in terms of our expense management pillars, which means that as we launch that whole maturation process, we're doing diagnostics. We've created a strategy and plan. We're communicating up, down, and sideways, and then we're going to execute. We have a governance pillar. I talked about the sourcing advisory councils that we put in place. We have monthly reviews with executives. We created dashboards in order to be able to make sure that we have the appropriate level of transparency. We're implementing a common taxonomy that's linked back to our general ledger. We've updated and upgraded our policies and standards, and we're really ensuring that as we go through this entire process, we're essentially tracking through a diagnostic heat map and in a very formal project plan the changes that we're making. And so whether that's the category strategies that are being stood up, whether it's the efficiency initiatives around reducing our cycle time, whether it's really making sure that those buying channels and spend categories and really looking at optimizing any choke points that we find in that approvals in partnership with finance. And we want to make sure that we're looking at our budget and cost targets. We're tracking our KPIs from a financial perspective. We're giving exception reporting because I honestly believe that a great way to impact the behaviors associated with the supply chain within a company is to really provide insight into any exceptions. We've introduced what's called a bid exception process, so that we do realize that there are times when you're going to have to single source, and in some instances sole source. And so we wanted to make sure that all of that is documented and is really in effect helping us to be much more efficient around what we're doing. If I could ask you to go to the next slide. So what you're seeing here is we're trying to define the value and the strategy that the organization is driving. And as you kind of take a look from essentially the 1 o'clock through the 12 o'clock, we're wanting better spend visibility to achieve our category strategies, right? Our sourcing processes have been redefined in order to make sure that they're much more effective. We're working on that supplier performance, and we partner very closely with our third-party governance organization and with our internal stakeholders to make sure that we're actually doing that supplier performance. The savings reporting, we're optimizing that, and one of the things that we've done is we are formally reporting out on a monthly basis to the executives so that they can actually see, and we partner with the CFOs in order for them to be able to understand where have we impacted the P&L? Where are there the cost savings that you can draw a line to and say, yes, we impacted that? Tighter compliance, right? It's going to drive additional value for the bank to make sure that we're actually following our guidelines from a regulatory perspective, but also just from doing good business. So there's a tremendous amount of effort and work that we're doing from a compliance perspective. And then agility, I've probably mentioned it 4 times now. Getting to yes quicker, giving the outcomes that we're wanting in a more efficient and effective manner, and helping to drive that is a crucial underpinning of what it is that we're trying to do as an organization, because it's really important. So in order to be able to do that, we're creating playbooks. We're making sure that we have the appropriate standardization. This is where having a good contract lifecycle management tool becomes very important for us, because it allows us to actually digitize that lifecycle of contract management. It gives us the ability to do that supplier performance monitoring more effectively. It allows us to make sure that we have the most current contracts and contract instruments in place with our third party. So very, 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 very important to what we're trying to do. And so that kind of leads us to the next slide, which is really talking about how we've structured. Now, again, a bank is essentially playing in the MRO space because we don't really manufacture anything, so it's all indirect. So we've created category teams. We've stood up a category management, and then we tie that and align it to our procure to pay. So there's really a lot of work that we're doing beneath each one of these areas in order for us to be much, much more effective in terms of benchmarking, in terms of making sure that we have an intelligent-based strategy that's helping us to drive, the underpinnings that we have. We're wanting to deliver value for money and proving that. We want to make sure that we're working with our businesses and reducing our total cost of ownership. The quality standards and controls are in place and transparent. We want to make sure that we're institutionalizing innovation. I actually belong to a group that does investments. It's called our Warrants Group. where we're looking at innovative suppliers that we can actually partner with. We want to make sure that we're achieving the functional targets while managing the risk and compliance, ultimately driving to the customer satisfaction that we think is so key to what we're trying to do. And so as you look at all of this and the people beneath it, we're assessing the skill levels. We're really trying to recruit for the type of resources that's going to come in with a welcome change and help us to drive the outcomes that we want. The team formation and alignment is based on global needs, because we believe that we need to have a follow the sun approach, and we need to make sure that that approach is really focused towards the outcomes that we're looking at. Which means that, as we're developing our self and personal skills, we want people that are self-aware. We want people that are natural problem solvers. We want folks that have the ability to cope with change, are honest, have high levels of integrity, and that lead by example. This is really important for us. And so I talked earlier about one of our core pillars there is around ethics. Okay, and so in order for us to be able to do that, we need to promote the ethical behavior, and we need to make sure that we're managing that with our policies, and we're managing our stakeholder activities in an ethical manner. We're eliminating shadow procurement activities. When we find them, we federate them. We look at the resources and we say, look, what you're doing is actually outside of the scope of what your organization is set up to do. Let's migrate those resources and that work into our group. And ultimately, that does help us to actually drive, I think, a more efficient and effective organization around what it is that we're trying to do. And so, when you start to think about that policy, that practice and technology with that end-to-end procurement cycle that we have, we want to make sure that we're, driving and developing a mature cost culture that is deploying the right level of best practices with the underlying tools. And that, I think, is a critically important attribute for us, because it enables us to be much more effective. And so, we've partnered with a third-party risk management organization to actually go through and to tier our organization, because our supply base, because you can't actually, if you go to the next slide, please. You can't actually manage all relationships at the same level. You need to be able to tier them effectively. Okay, and you need to be able to use the types of tools that are going to enable us to really manage the relationships based on the strategic nature and the criticality that they have for us. So this is beyond risk. This is really looking at it. So how are we doing that comprehensive management? How are we managing those obligations? Well, you can't do that if you can't see it. And you can't see it if you don't have the ability to take it and reduce existing legacy contracts into the metadata that they have, pull that into a process that's going to allow us to actually look at it, measure it, and drive it. Okay, and so whether it's doing auto invoice validation, or whether it's actually going back and looking historically at what's actually transpired within that relationship, all of those things are extremely critical to the work that we're trying to do, and you need to be able to do that with varying degrees of tools, process, etc. Because it's important for us to understand what is the company buying and how critical is that to what we're doing. Okay, how are we buying it? Okay, and how much does it cost? Who's authorized to buy it? How do we manage it once we buy it, and how do we take it through that life cycle so that we have the ability to manage effectively with the right lens based on the right level, whether that's risk, whether that's cost, whether that's criticality and need to the business, et cetera. And so all of these things really require us to think through, what it is that we're doing. And underpinning a lot of this is our purchasing taxonomy and our other reference data that enables us to be able to structure what we're trying to do. And it's really a way for us to kind of think through this process. So my view is that it's really important for us to be thinking through these types of activities on a regular basis, and to make sure that we're not doing it in a vacuum. That's why we have to partner with our 3 lines of defense, so that we're able to ensure that we're having the right level of review and challenge across what we're trying to do. If I could ask you to go to the next slide, this will start to kind of give you a view as to how we're actually leveraging the technology to really drive the outcomes that we're coming. So we talked about what we're doing in terms of our procurement stack, how we're using Oracle, how we've had a kind of a mix of tools, whether it was for a contract repository, whether it was a CLM tool, or the SharePoint, whether it was Oracle's PeopleSoft, et cetera. All of that needs to change as we're going through this, and it's an incredible amount of work that is a multi-year transformation journey. So we started this transformation about this time last year. We say that it's going to be a couple of year journey. So we're about a year into it, and we know that some of these things are starting to come into play, and we know that there are certain things that won't actually even be live until the second quarter of 2021. But all that said, it's all kind of like a jigsaw puzzle that we're putting the pieces in place. And frankly, I think it's more like a Rubik's Cube because it's multidimensional. And we're trying to make sure that we're putting in best-in-class tools that are going to enable us to be able to avail ourselves. And where we have a legacy tool for a period of time, we're trying to avail ourselves of RPA, robotic process automation. We're trying to make sure that we're underpinning this with AI, and that a lot of that AI and machine learning is coming to us through our selection of our contract lifecycle management tool. As I mentioned at the top of the conversation, that's our work that we're doing with SirionLabs. So as you kind of look across the strategic supplier lifecycle, you can see that we have a various number of tools. Some of them will remain, some of them will be superseded, and some of them will be replaced with new technology. But all of this, I think, is extremely important for us to be able to make sure that we have kind of that client shared services view, where we're doing our contract administration, our order management, our compliance, how we're actually making sure that we're using the right level of buying channels, whether that's a catalog, et cetera. And all of these things ultimately are going to help us to be able to transform, much more effectively and to be much more effective around what it is that we're doing. So again, I talk a lot about change, but with that requires us to make sure that we have the right governance, and that governance is done through both a formal program that I have from the transformation that has a weekly readout, as well as really making sure that we have templatized a lot of what it is that we have to do in order for us to really drive the outcomes that we want, with the ingestion of these new tools that we're standing up that ultimately are going to give us, I think, a much better supply chain. And all of this, again, has to be tied to how we're actually managing our non-comp costs, which ultimately will then improve our cost-to-income ratio, which hopefully will result in a better earnings per share for our shareholders, because that's essentially why we're doing these types of things. So with that, if we can go to the next slide, you'll start to see, as we focus down a little bit from a lens perspective into what we're doing with our contract and supplier management tool using the SirionLabs scenario. And this is really around how are we doing our authoring, our contract repository, our performance management, our invoice auditing, and our supplier collaboration. This has multiple inputs and downstream multiple outputs around that ecosystem. So a tool is just a tool, but it's how you use that tool as part of that larger life cycle that I talked about, in terms of the alignment of the activities and the goals that we're driving, in order to be able to ensure that we're putting in place a better user experience that's giving us, a much more impactful life cycle. Okay, and so it's difficult without having this level of information to forecast. It's difficult without this level of information to be able to really say, where are those arbitrage points that I've seen historically, and how do I close the door on them? How do we make sure that we're really extending the reach of our capability and taking that analysis that traditionally was siloed? whether that was our accounts payable data, whether that was essentially data associated with one-off contracts that were not going through a centralized process. So by now having all of this centralized and then applying machine learning to it, that's allowing us to really kind of deploy a much more robust supplier framework. That in turn is allowing us to really plug the leakage that we've seen and to do cost recovery where possible. All of these things I think are extremely important as we're trying to eliminate or reduce as significantly as possible the manual intervention that we've had to do across the supply chain. So that now we have the ability to really look at how we're able to drive the spend in the most effective manner, manage the contracts so that we're being fair on both sides, and manage our cash flow from a payables perspective. There's a tremendous amount of insight can be gained from the work that we're doing there. And so, you know, I know that I've spoken quite a bit, but what I'm doing is I'm trying to make sure that we're ranking and prioritizing, taking into consideration the key constraints and enablers that we have as we're changing our organization, understanding our capabilities and resources and channeling them into the most effective way possible to help our company achieve its goals. And this is helping us to calculate our opportunity costs and to use metrics to justify the new investments in the tools and the talent with an eye towards efficiency and effectiveness of the supply chain. How do we make ourselves step out of that traditional role of just somebody who's trying to drive costs and actually start to drive the type of value that is critical if we're actually going to be successful as a firm, especially now during this COVID-19 period? How do we take the tools that we have to help us manage those supply relationships more effectively? So with that, if I could turn it over to the next slide and to Ajay.
Joseph, what a fabulous account of what was an extremely complex journey, but sounds so simple when you describe it. And what I'd like to do in the few minutes that are with me is to maybe give some color to some of the remarks that you made, Joseph, and bring some of these more abstract concepts to life. So just a quick introduction to SirionLabs and who we are. We are an enterprise SaaS company focusing on contract management. And I think what we are really known for worldwide is how we leverage AI and RPA to transform the way buyers and suppliers engage with each other. And what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is I'm going to bring to life some of these use cases and scenarios that Joseph made reference to over the last half an hour. I'll talk very concretely about how AI and RPA kind of make this impact in contract management. So let's start with an eye on the past. I'm going to do this in 3 slices of time for you. We're going to start by looking at the role of technology when it comes to sizing up our past. And the past, for most people, is comprised of their portfolio, their legacy contracts, and the risk that's inherited inside them, also the promises that are embedded inside them. So the question is, when we have 100 contracts, yes, we can go read them. 1,000 perhaps, but when those numbers get to the tens of thousands and maybe even the hundreds of thousands, what role does technology play in illuminating what lies inside these contracts? And I think what you're seeing in front of you on the left-hand side is a page of contract. Highlighted in the middle of that is a particular paragraph. And now if you glance over to the right, on the top, you are seeing the various types of data objects that are coming out of the left, starting with metadata, then clauses, then obligations, service levels, and tables. These are examples of complex embedded data types or data objects sitting inside the contract. And in this particular case, notice and mitigation, you can see here that the example of the extracted text sitting on the right. So it's showing you the notice that needs to be given in the event of a force majeure clause, which I think a lot of people in this day and age are focused on, given the situation that we find ourselves in. And this is a perfect example of how technology can be used without any kind of manual intervention to shine a light on the past by automatically extracting the data and the content that we need at a moment like this. So with that, let's now move to the next dimension of this. Once that data has been extracted, it still has to be consumed. And I think that a lot of the AI that's in the market today overlooks this very critical dimension of AI and RPA by just leaving it at the level of that raw extracted data that we saw on the previous slide. I think the next step that's very critical is packaging that raw extracted data into usable insights like the type that we're seeing in front of us right now. You know, how many of the contracts lack a data protection clause? How many of them have proper audit rights inside them, etc., etc. So these kinds of packaged insights, which are collating the raw data extracted from the contracts and putting them into an actionable state, this is a very key ingredient of the overall journey from AI and RPA and eliminating. Otherwise, it would be back to human beings looking at that extracted data and then putting together such dashboards using Excel and PPT. So the reporting aspect of it, again, still working with the past, but now going from extraction to description. Next slide, please. Once that data has been extracted, we now come to the present. And the present really for most of us consists of how we use technology to animate our contracting playbooks. Our contracting playbooks are like a guideline. They express our corporate policies. They enable us to understand what our preferred position is at any point in time. But when we're negotiating a contract, we're frequently encountering third-party positions that are quite distant from our preferred positions. So can technology, can AI, can RPA automatically read the incoming contract from or incoming draft from a third party and identify where the various variations and the variances have come in and how far they have taken us from our preferred positions? And what you see in front of you is exactly something like that, is the third party draft sitting on the left and how the technology is automatically capturing, let's say, the dispute resolution clause and showing not only which position it's similar to, but what the other alternatives are that can be used to redline that particular clause. So this is, let's say, shining a light on the present, how we negotiate the active risk that can be created in the negotiation of contracts. Let's keep going. So now that we've dealt with the past and the present, let's talk a little about the future, and in particular about how the promises sitting inside contracts can be enforced, how the performance of parties can be monitored, and how those promises, in a sense, can be brought to life without excessive manual intervention. I think in the old world, and when I say old world, I'm talking literally 10 years ago, there was this concept of DNO registers. People who were managing complex obligations used to create deliverable and obligation registers, DNO registers, and these were nothing but gigantic Excel workbooks where they would store each and every deliverable, milestone, and obligation triggered, one time, financially negotiated, etc., etc., and then they would track those to closure. The question is, can we go past that? Can we take the embedded values that are inside the contract, and track the vendor's performance automatically by connecting to business transaction systems like Clarity, like MSPP or ServiceNow, and build a bridge between the promises in the contract and the actual service delivery that's happening at the back end. And once we've done that, and that's what you're seeing on the top left here, is the service levels by performance status on a global level, or service levels met or not met by category. Again, this is being done by using elastic technology to automatically compute these service levels using algorithmic versions of the service level formulae contained inside the contract. Now, once we've done that, once we know what the actual performance is versus the promised, why can't we predict what the invoice should be? The only thing missing is the consumption data. And once we can create a feed of the consumption data, we know what's inside the contract in terms of the price sheets, and we also know what the vendor's performance is. We should actually be able to predict what the invoice looks like or should look like, and use that to compare and contrast it against the actual invoice of the supplier. And that's what you're seeing in front of you, is how that interaction with transaction systems can create a situation where the invoice, and particularly a complex invoice, can be audited. And I would probably add one dimension to this. One of the most recurring problems that big enterprises face today, they have very good ERP systems, they have good P2P systems, and they also have good contract repositories. But they don't have an efficient way to track changes in their price book or their price register as those are happening real time. And I think what I'm trying to indicate to you and show you here on the previous slide and on this one is how technology and AI in particular can come in and ingest these amendments, these changes to the price books as they are happening, and update the price register so that our ability to audit these invoices with the latest and greatest price changes is that much more current. Thank you. Can we move to the next slide, please? So this kind of, continuing on this journey of the future of keeping these promises alive in the contracts, we now talk a little more about other enterprise transaction systems, and we talk in particular about the financial systems where the spend data is being stored, and we use that to track the original business case. I think what happens very frequently, particularly in complex services contracts, is that the original business case tends to get obscured as the demand keeps changing from internal business users, and additional SOWs and amendments and POs keep getting signed. So to be able to track the expected versus the actual spend, whether as a result of inefficiency or as a result of demand inflation, is a very key component. And I think that increasingly, as we go into the future, contract management systems will be required to have more of a real-time relationship with the financial systems, so that the financial commitments inside the contract and the original business case driving that contract can be dynamically tracked against the actual spend or the actual business case that results from the engagement. Next slide, please. And I think if we can understand how technology can be used to shine a light on the past, to improve our negotiations in the present, if we can use it also to monitor the performance and the invoices of the future, we should also be able to learn from all of this interaction and do a better job of negotiating our contracts in the future. We should be doing a better job of reconciling our demand forecasting against actual usage and so on. So this is what we call predictive analytics. And I'll give you two examples. One is, let's say that we are a large global company, like Unilever, like Procter & Gamble. We negotiate global framework agreements, and we also have country-specific spending that's enabled under country-level agreements. Now, We get country level forecasts from each of those country managers, we roll them up, and then we give a forecast to the end supplier. And then the actual consumption begins. And as the actual consumption begins, we find certain countries over forecasted and some countries under forecasted. How can we use this to dynamically adjust the forecasts that come in for the following year? Similarly, a second example is we get a lot of service level requests, let's say on uptime, on availability, and we use that to negotiate a 99.99 availability service level with our telco provider. What we find in practice is that service level is getting breached quite frequently. It goes down to 99.9 or to 99.95. But when we look at our CSAT scorecards from our internal business users, none of them seem to have noticed this slippage in the service level. So perhaps we over-negotiated that service level. So these are examples of how a CLM system, once it starts talking to the adjacent transaction systems in the manner Joseph was describing, it can actually give us an insight into our behavior and help us to negotiate contracts and terms that are closer to our actual requirements. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm going to now turn it back to my colleague DJ, and we will take questions in the remaining 5 minutes that are available to us. DJ?
Thank you, Ajay. We have a few questions here. The first one is for Joseph. How has the CPO's role evolved over the last 10 years? And what are some of the newer challenges or complexities that have cropped up recently?
Good question. When you think about it, the procurement function has traditionally been all about cost cutting. So the main job of the CPO is to negotiate the best deals in terms of pricing, delivery timelines, logistics, and more. But over the past 10 years, there has been a noticeable shift in the way organizations view this function. The cross-functional nature of the procurement department ensures that the CPO can no longer operate in a silo. So today, the CPO is required to think like a CEO, focus on key business drivers, not just from a procurement standpoint, but from an organizational-wide perspective. So, it's an evolution of the role that is really a focus has shifted from savings to creating business value. Okay, and so when you think about that, the CPO must drive digital transformation in the company's supply chain while managing the strategic internal and external partnerships. That's a little bit of a balancing act. So, you need to have the ability to pivot quickly to a changing global situation. And, very recently, as you know, this whole COVID-19 pandemic has caused that shift. There's also, significant operational difficulties that, many global organizations are facing today. And so you need to be able to ensure that you have the right resources for the right investment in a sustained and predictable manner. So that goes to what I talked about earlier, the right channel, the right supplier, the right price. But today's CPO needs to be thinking about compliance. They need to play an active role in mergers and acquisitions. They need to participate in firm-wide strategic initiatives. And so this really starts to rebalance what they're doing. The CPO of today needs to think about environmental responsibility as well as supply chain risk, something that they traditionally were not really involved in. And so that while the cost efficiency component will always be there, the priorities are changing. So the CPO needs to be, innovative, and they need to have the ability to contribute to the growing the top line for the business where they can by reducing the non-comp costs, by ensuring that, that you're putting the right team on the field, so to speak. So, they also need to be alert to the various evolving geopolitical equations and compliance rules across the multiple geographies. If you're doing business in Singapore, as an example, you better understand what the Monetary Authority of Singapore is doing. If you're working in various parts of the world, you need to understand what those regulatory environments are. So that's I think an essential change that has happened over the last 10 years or so. And so A CPO historically has been measured on their track record, but it's not just about the ability to deliver in the past. It's really, do they have the credibility with their stakeholders? Can they really be alliance partners with suppliers, with team members, with C-level executives? And so that's really changing from a functional expertise to actually being much more of a change agent and visionary. So I think that there's been a significant evolution as to what the role is, and you're starting to see more and more CPOs be on executive committees. They're being put on boards, et cetera. So hopefully I've answered your question. I know we're almost out of time.
Thank you, Joseph. Tim, if there's one more question, if you can take 30 seconds to answer this one. People seem to agree that the pandemic has exposed key weaknesses in current enterprise technology. What are the most critical gaps that need to be addressed from procurement's perspective?
Probably if I had 30 seconds, DJ, I'd probably say the need for collaboration. So this is not just within the enterprise, it's also across enterprise boundaries. And increasingly, we believe it's going to be in the management of supply ecosystems, not just supply chains. And the second critical thing, I think, is the absence of data flows and the critical importance of starting to build robust platforms such as that provided by SirionLabs to actually enable the sort of integration levels of data that Joseph has been discussing.
Thank you so much for that quick response, Tim. And so that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you everyone for attending. And at the end of the webinar, you'll see a survey. Please do provide us your valuable feedback and do join us for more such events in the future. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.